I'm Jamil Olawale Kasako, and this is American Chameleon. Tracy K. Smith is the newly appointed chair of the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton University. She just wrapped her second term as Poet Laureate of the United States. She's the author of several books of poetry: The Body's Question, Duende, Life on Mars, and Wade in the Water. It was a pleasure to hear her share her words. I'm sure you will enjoy. Tracy K. Smith, Plotus. It's really a pleasure to be in conversation with you and just to spend some time. Just to tell you a little bit about this podcast, this idea, this concept. I'm calling it Chameleon. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about how we shield, how we create refuge, how we shapeshift as a way of making sense of the world that we are in, specifically as artists, but as people of color, as minorities, as Americans. Honestly, we're in a very turbulent moment, to say the least. And so with that, I'm curious to know, are there certain strategies or ways in which you've considered poetry as a way of shielding or creating a kind of refuge or a way of being in the world?
Definitely. A few years ago, I thought that my energy was going to remain devoted to writing prose for a little while longer. I finished a memoir, and I felt like I had more of a desire to learn this other form. And then I found my mind and my heart pulled in the direction where the only thing that seemed consoling to me was poetry, because there are unanswerable questions that I have. There's a great sense of fear and anxiety that I find myself living with, which feels different and new. I worry more about my children in a way that's not just the involuntary mother worry that every parent has, but it's a reaction to the dangers of the world. I think I've always asked this question, like, what does it mean to be American? But the question has returned with a different kind of urgency. What is this country? What did I think it was? And how is that different now than it was just a few years ago? I've been looking at and thinking about history as a way of trying to figure out how we got to where we are. The last poem in my most recent book is called An Old Story. And whenever I read it, I say, oh, this is my attempt to write a myth. This is the myth that I think we need right now in 2019. But I think every poem is an attempt to write the necessary myth or the map out of, the dark moment or the bleak moment, the wrong moment. So that's a big part of what I feel like I've been trying to make my own voice do and listening for in the voices of others, even in poems that have been written, decades or generations ago. But I feel like there's more. My answer to that question ought to have something to do with the wish that I always have to get lost, to let my own voice and imagination or that of, whoever I'm reading pull me out of myself, out of the sense of belonging to something finite. The word eternity comes up a lot in this new book. And I think it's because I'm yearning toward something that might make a different and better kind of sense than the human and the logical, which right now doesn't feel very logical.
I hear you. I was hoping maybe you could share that poem with us from Wade in the Water.
Oh, sure. This is called An Old Story. We were made to understand it would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate, swollen to a kind of epic wind, livid the land and ravaged like a rageful dream. The worst in us having taken over and broken the rest utterly down. A long age passed when at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now lost. Something large and old awoke. And then our singing brought on a different manner of weather. Then animals, long believed gone, crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such color.
Tracy, you've branched out into your own podcast series yourself, The Slowdown. So there's this proposal to slow down, take a moment, listen. Can you talk a little bit about that project? What inspired it? Where do you envision it going?
Sure, yeah. So The Slowdown is a daily 5-minute poetry podcast. I read a poem by a different poet every day. And in the few minutes before that, I try and think around some of the emotional space that the poem speaks to. It's not a craft class. It's not even really a description of what is happening within the poem, but I'm talking near some of the feelings that the poem activates for me. What I hope that might do is allow somebody who's listening, at work, in the car, or while cooking dinner or something, helping to draw that person to a place where the poem could hit home. It comes out of this idea that we need to go quiet sometimes and submit to the voice and the subjectivity of other people. Even if it's an imagined other person that the poet has invented, that voice is speaking to some aspect of what it feels like to be human in the world. And I think the more versions of that we can get, the better we are. And the more receptive we are to other versions of humanness and life when we meet it in the form of other people.
On a recent episode, you talked about crying, unashamedly crying. And I'm curious to know your connection to emotion inside of your practice, whether it be crying or laughing or any other sort of visceral just outlet of emotion.
Yeah. I love that question. When I first started writing poetry as a 19 or 20-year-old, I liked the authority in the voices of poets like Derek Walcott or Seamus Heaney, Yusef Komunyakaa. And so that's what I was attempting to imitate in a lot of ways. And now I can see very clearly. I was a kid. I was confused. I was away from home for the first time, and I was lacking in authority, and there was something that I wanted to be able to claim or step into. And then I got a little bit older and I realized it was hard to write a poem from that perspective all the time, even a little bit of the time. And I started to realize that if I could ask questions in poems, then I was able to be honest about what I didn't know, what I wondered, and maybe I could invite the reader to think in unison with me. Then I guess as I got older and experienced different kinds of loss, I felt the need to bring those things into the work because poems were helping me ask my own questions and wrestle with possible answers or even just routes toward clarity. And so emotion is something that often gets me started. But a poem is so effective at exacting something from you that you didn't know you had to give, at guiding you to a kind of clarity that you didn't know, maybe you hoped but didn't know was possible. Maybe I see it as the rigor of language that says, okay, you want to cry, you're a mess, that's what's happening here, but maybe this ghazal can help us cover a little bit of distance while that happens. And so I'm looking for these different pulls in anything that I'm writing. And maybe it's humor and gravity, or maybe it's anger that is anchored by a sense of vulnerability. But I'm eager to see what those possibilities for like marrying one emotion to another kind of impulse might yield.
Maybe you would be willing to read another piece for us?
Okay, I just brought this one book with me.
I have plenty in my bag.
Oh, yeah? Well, maybe I'll read something for not pressed for time. Can I read something from Life on Mars? Do you have that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So this is a poem from Life on Mars, or rather a section in a poem sequence called The Speed of Belief. And this is a sequence that's an elegy for my father, who passed away while I was writing these poems. And it happened rather quickly. And all of a sudden, I found myself in this place of needing to do something with the grief that I was living with. I was also pregnant for the first time with my daughter, and there was something really, I don't know, for want of a better word, something exciting about thinking that there were these two people on the other side that somehow I was connected to. And so my imagination had this wish to imagine, like, where is my dad? What has he gone to? What has he returned to? This poem maybe begins to ask that question. What does the storm set free? Spirits stripped of flesh on their slow walk. The poor in cities learn, when there is no place to lie down, walk. At night, the streets are minefields. Only sirens drown out the cries. If you're being followed, hang on to yourself and run. No, walk. I wandered through evenings of lit windows, laughter inside walls, the soul steps amid street lamps, errant stars. Nothing else below, walked. When we believed in the underworld, we buried fortunes for our dead. Low country of dogs and servants, where ghosts in gold-stitched robes walk. Old loves turn up in dreams, still livid at every slight. Show them out. This bed is full. Our limbs tangle in sleep, but our shadows walk. Perhaps one day it will be enough to live a few seasons and return to ash. No children to carry our names, no grief. Life will be a brief, hollow walk. My father won't lie still, though his legs are buried in trousers and socks. But where does all he knew, and all he must now know, walk? So a lot of the poems in that sequence rely on different received forms, like the ghazal or the terzerima, the sonnet. And again, it was a way of trying to bolster the sense of emotion that I had, this kind of raw wish to sit down and think in words about this person that I loved without any real roadmap. The form came in and said, okay,
here's a map.
Here's a tissue and a map.
I have experienced quite a bit of loss myself. I lost my father recently. I was catapulted back to some memories of my own papa.
I'm sorry. I feel like it's like this really interesting space that we can go to. I feel good when I can go to that sad place sometimes, like 'cause I feel close to just traces of this person that I love, or close to something that hasn't gone away completely.
This has been part 1 of my 2-part conversation with former poet laureate Tracy K. Smith. Join me for part 2 and bonus content coming soon. Tracy's podcast, The Slowdown, is available on all podcast platforms. Take a listen. American Chameleon is produced with support from the New England Foundation for the Arts, with production, sound design, and engineering by Ling Ling Yang, Paulus Van Horn, Everett Assis Saunders, Connor Anderson, and me. With special thanks to Impact, Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center at Rensselaer Polytechnic, and Red Bull Arts Detroit for providing residency, recording space, and engineering assistance. This is American Chameleon. Till next time.